I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Andrew George.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to raise the issue, although it's a rather grave issue, the grave issue of providing affordable housing in the housing emergency-ridden, if you like, communities of Cornwall and indeed on the Isles of Scilly. I'm grateful to those engaged in business earlier this evening to have permitted us a little extra time in order to explore this issue, and perhaps it was done for good reason, in order that the grave and important issues of Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly could be properly and fully debated this evening. I welcome the Minister to his place this evening, and I know that those on these benches, and indeed myself, very, very warmly welcome him and fully take on board the sincerity and intensity and determination of the government to address the very serious housing problems which exist across the country, the housing emergencies which exist in so many communities, as well as those in Cornwall and indeed on the Isles of Scilly. In doing so, I also should declare an interest because during my nine years sabbatical from this House, I went back to my profession as a chief executive of a registered provider, a housing charity, working at the front line on pre-development work and delivering affordable homes for local people. It is a challenging environment, and indeed one which, because of the man-made nature, as it were, man and woman-made nature of the regulatory environment in which professionals operate within that environment, as well as the topographical challenges which we face in places like Cornwall, that it is a little like trying to push boulders up a very steep slope. And I hope that the Minister will take into account that if measures can be taken to improve the availability of opportunities for those who are ticking all the right boxes to deliver genuinely affordable, in perpetuity affordable homes, which are desperately needed in our communities, that this government will do this. Now, of course, this is not my maiden speech, and as having taken a sabbatical, perhaps it was an enforced sabbatical, but one I enjoyed, away from this chamber for so long, I would, in other normal circumstances, praise my predecessor. We didn't share much in the way of political agreement, but he worked very hard for the constituency and achieved a great deal, and indeed strived on a large number of projects, Mr. Derek Thomas. I hope that I will reflect the efforts that he has made in order to ensure that those projects are delivered during my time in this House. Because it's not my maiden speech, I don't need to therefore remind the House, as I did on the 22nd of May 1997, that my constituency is, of course, the most beautiful and most remarkable place in the country, and occupied by the most beautiful, remarkable people. Therefore, I won't. On beauty? Am I giving away on beauty or remarkable? Oh, okay, on both points.
First of all, can I commend the Honourable Member for St Ives, and it's good to see him back in his place, and he brought much to the chamber when he was here before, and I was very fortunate to share some time with him in this chamber. We have many things in common. The first thing is we have a beautiful constituency. Second thing we have is the same issue, the issue of affordable housing and its accessibility. Does the Honourable Member agree and very much welcome Government's manifesto pledge to increase housing, which I understand it has? And in my area where the housing lists are absolutely massive, does the honourable gentleman agree when it comes to government having a policy must be better streamlined planning, number one, allocate funding to getting families into homes, and does he finally and thirdly agree that what we do need is a strategy and a programme motivated and driven by Westminster here for all the regions of this great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because I always said we can always do it better together. Thank you so much.
And indeed, the honourable member, I'm grateful to him for his intervention, and indeed he anticipates many of the subjects which I'll be coming on to, which is about delivery and streamlining of the planning and so on. Part of my background is not only in the delivery of housing through a community land trust and the charitable housing sector, but also in my voluntary time. I was also for many years involved in Penzance Street Food Project, and was working at the front line addressing and speaking to people who were suffering from the most severe housing problems in the country. And indeed, in Cornwall, we often have to repeat that although people come and have, as I know the Minister did, have very enjoyable holidays, beneath that veneer there are extremely severe housing problems, and severe and exceptional levels of homelessness, which are beyond the vision of those who come and enjoy our beautiful beaches and our beautiful environment and our wall-to-wall sunshine. In respect of what I intend to cover this evening, and I've given the Minister advance notice of some of the subjects I intend to cover, is to perhaps probe a little harder the government's intention to raise house building targets and to challenge the way in which we can properly make sure that if we're to build more homes, that we make sure that it's actually going to address need rather than developers' greed. And I'll be coming back to that in a moment. And also, perhaps under the surface, and I think a lot of people are not fully aware, that actually the public purse is making a very major contribution to the injustices going on in the housing sector, in that multi-million pounds of public money are going into the pockets of holiday home owners, especially through various tax loopholes and indeed through COVID aid grants and others, that clearly is driving the sector in the opposite direction to which we believe that it should indeed be going. Just by way of a little bit of background, Cornwall itself has very high levels of housing need. The latest Home Choice Register has the level at 20,332. But of course that's after a recent the annual administrative process of removing people who have not been active on the register for the previous year, and the month before that it was 27,000. So you can kind of see how the numbers actually oscillate. And indeed, from my experience of undertaking housing needs surveys across many communities in Cornwall, that often underplays the very significant level of unexpressed housing need. And indeed, we often find that the level of need in most communities is double what is recorded, at least double what is recorded on the Home Choice Register, because so many people think that it's a waste of time putting their name on it because they have very little chance of ever getting a home. And of course, every geographic location has has housing problems of one type or another. But as I say, in Cornwall, we face rather unique. Some other places experience similar problems, but a unique combination of problems within the area, including, for example, that we have just 12.8% of the housing stock is social housing against a national average of 17.1%. And although there is 20% of the housing stock or thereabouts is private rented, which is round about the national average, it's an extremely vulnerable sector. And what we find is that, particularly in recent years, is that a large proportion of that, the families within it, have found that they are on the verge of being evicted in order to make way for yet more holiday lets. It's an extremely vulnerable sector to find yourself in. Now, of course, housing completions have been very good. We've got a very effective housing registered provider housing association sector delivering well, and indeed Cornwall has one of the best delivery in terms of numbers across the country in terms of local authority areas. But of course, it achieves that in circumstances where it is one of the larger local authorities. So it is bound to end up in that kind of end of the league, if you like. My first substantive point, which I wish to make to the Minister, however, is in relation to the government's stated intentions with regard to house building targets. And I completely get and I fully endorse and support the intentions of the government with regard to delivering in order to meet housing need. But I would just simply say to the Minister, as indeed I did to the Deputy Prime Minister when the announcement was made in July, that if you take the case of Cornwall, that provides a really sound basis on which actually simply house building targets do not work. So in the case of Cornwall, we're one of the fastest growing places in the United Kingdom, almost trebled its housing stock in the last 60 years. And I've been living there through most of those years. And yet the housing problems at the end of all that have got worse. And I'm not saying that if you hadn't built any houses, it would be better. But I'm simply saying that simply setting very high housing targets in itself does not address the housing needs. And believing in this kind of two-dimensional view that somehow that it's simply a relationship between supply and demand, and an equilibrium will be found, and therefore the prices will reflect what local wages can afford. That is simply and never has been the case in Cornwall, which is really a reflection of in effect, a sub-London housing market, because of the nature of the way in which house prices are very significantly inflated by people and property investors buying second and holiday homes in places like Cornwall, which pushes the figures up very significantly. The present local plan, 2010 to 2030, the house building figures are, or the house targets are, is 52,500, and presently the government's proposal is to increase those projections from 2,707 properties per annum to 4,454 under the new formula. What we need to do, and I would urge the Minister to allow places like Cornwall to perhaps be granted the devolved powers to actually vary the way in which we achieve what needs to be done in our local environment. Simply not just to give us house building figures, but to set targets to reduce housing need. I mean, after all, house building targets themselves are a means to an end. The end is meeting the housing need, and if we've simply built the homes and it hasn't achieved the purpose, then we have to ask ourselves the question: are we going about it the right way? The government's new standard method has a different starting point from the old method. It's based on a two-step process of a 0.8% annual uplift on existing housing stock, plus a further uplift for the affordability gap. The problem with that approach is that in places like Cornwall, is that it bakes in the demand for second and holiday homes, because that has to be included in those overall figures. And that was a problem in the previous plan, where indeed the inspector said when we had our local plan projections rejected and the inspector wrote in much higher figures, that in fact we had to increase the numbers to 52,500, by more than another 5,000 homes, in order to address, as they put it, the growing demand for second homes within Cornwall. Now, we have a growing demand, indeed a high demand, for affordable homes, and though that should be baked into the figures, and we should have a mechanism by which we can deliver it, because the way in which the system works is we get all the second investment properties. The developers are very pleased to do those, but they're not so keen to deliver the genuinely affordable homes, and those are the ones that we need. So, I mean, there's a simplistic view that that there is this equilibrium between supply and demand, and also there's a presupposition that developers will release properties in the market when the government's policy achieves, as its stated intention is, to actually reduce the price of houses within that locality. And we found that they only release them at times when there's housing inflation. So that's simply not the case. And from my experience at the development end, trying to deliver the affordable homes which local people need, the policy is counterproductive, because what actually happens is if you increase the numbers of homes that are announced in the local plan, what happens is that the hope value of land adjoining every single community in Cornwall goes through the roof. And if you go there as a local housing charity and say, I would like to look at your land and build some affordable homes on it, they're not going to talk to a housing charity. They're going to wait for the lottery win when they get the full open market development value on that land, which is significantly greater than what a local charity can offer. So I would just urge the Minister to have a conversation with those who are trying to deliver the products on the ground, to perhaps set targets to reduce need rather than developers' greed, because I'm afraid that's what housing targets do. In places like Cornwall, maybe elsewhere they might have a different effect, a different impact. I'll say to him again, I mean, please come to Cornwall, come to the Isles of Scilly, see what it's like. I'm sure that all of the local MPs who for the area, who are all champions for their own localities, will be fighting hard to address these issues. A further point which I wish to make is simply because I was using this tool as someone working within the sector on a regular basis, was the rural exceptions policy, and the Minister will know that I've raised this one with him already. It works well indeed. Since the 1990s, when it was first introduced, it has been very effective in being able to deliver affordable homes on land which would not otherwise get planning permission. And all I would say to the Minister is that look at ways in which we can expand and indeed grow the development on rural exception site. In Cornwall, we're doing very well. We deliver, I think, 50% of what is delivered on rural exception sites across the whole of England, and across the whole of England in comparison, and about 20 to 30% of delivery in Cornwall is through rural exception sites. And what the local authority has done, and indeed we as a charity sector have been campaigning for them to do, is to extend the entitlement to deliver rural exception developments from the smaller villages to the edge of towns as well. Now, it may sound counterintuitive, but one of the best ways of delivering affordable homes is to draw the development boundary very tight around a local community and to use rural exception as a way of ensuring that you keep the development land values low and deliver genuinely affordable homes. The other thing I would urge him to do is to perhaps correct the mistake made by Cornwall some 15 years ago, which is to not allow cross subsidy. rural exception sites, because what has happened is that has created a slippery slope in which more and more landowners and private developers will find ways around normal planning procedure and use rural exception sites as a Trojan horse in order to crowbar in far many more unaffordable homes on those sites than would otherwise be the case if we stuck to the principle of the policy itself. I mean, against this, of course, there is a very significant challenge in terms of the construction industry inflation itself, which is, of course, affecting Cornwall as it is many other places, and that's affected and actually caused a lot of developments in places all around Cornwall to be stalled as the value, as the cost to value ratios have simply resulted in the unviability of many projects. And I would urge the Minister to look, as I'm sure he is, at Homes England's affordable housing programme, which obviously, whilst they're looking into the future for the next 5 to 10 years, the current programme up to 2026 needs a further injection in order to address the current difficulties which many developments face. I did say that I would address the issue of housing and justice, and I'm just conscious of time, and I know other people wish to speak, so I'll just very briefly simply say that I mean, when I was first elected in 1997, the Conservatives had just at that stage introduced the 50% council tax discount for second homes, and I campaigned against that at the time, and grateful to Chris Mullins and Chris Mullin and the late Michael Meacher for being receptive to the arguments at that stage to remove the 50% council tax discount. But of course the Conservatives also then in 2012 introduced another loophole which had allowed second home owners to flip their properties from second homes so registered for council tax to be registered for business rates as a holiday let, simply if they could demonstrate that the property was available for 140 nights a year. They didn't need to let it, but they had to be available for 140 nights a year as a holiday let, and then they could apply for small business rate relief and pay nothing at all. So you end up with a situation where all of that has to be covered by the Treasury. And in a place like Cornwall, that resulted in initially £6.5 million in 2012 when I first blew the whistle on it when I was still an MP, going each year in a place like Cornwall to holiday home owners. And within a couple of years, that had doubled. There's been an industrial level movement of properties from council tax to business rates. And of course then, when COVID happened, all of those were entitled to a COVID grant as well on top of that. So the result of that and the furnished holiday lettings and other loopholes which were available, in Cornwall alone, over 10 years, you ended up with £500 million of taxpayers' money, which has been expended, taxpayers' money, that's our money, expended, put in the pockets of holiday home owners, at a time when only half that amount was going into housing associations to deliver affordable homes. So I would urge the Minister to work with his Treasury colleagues to close those loopholes and to find far better ways of using that money. Because if, as the Prime Minister rightly says, those with the broadest shoulders should bear the greatest burden, then certainly that's an area where that burden, I think, should be borne by those people who can afford extra properties and property investment in holiday and second homes. That's an inappropriate way in which we should ever be spending public money, in my view. I said to the Minister I wanted to briefly mention the Isles of Scilly, and I hope that he'll come and visit the Isles of Scilly. At present, it's surprising to a lot of people that it's currently experiencing depopulation, largely driven by the lack of affordable housing. And as someone working in that sector and again declaring an interest, you know, I've been working on a project with the council. Our charity had been to deliver, and we had the planning permission, everything else, for 12 self-built affordable homes for local families desperately needed. The islands have only had somewhere between I think it was eight homes built there in the last 10 years. So 12 affordable homes for local people, self-build. But the construction costs are so high, it costs 3 times as much to deliver a home on the Isles of Scilly as it does on the mainland. And it didn't meet the Homes England requirements as far as subsidies were concerned. So I would encourage the Minister to have a look at this very special environment which exists on the Isles of Scilly in order to address the housing needs there. 28 miles off the mainland coast. Not easy to simply say that community you can kind of commute to and fro, because you simply can't. I would also urge him to look at the community-led homes sector. I mean, if you want to change the whole narrative in the way in which communities operate, give people the power to start representing themselves and representing the housing needs of local people. So community land trust, co-housing communities and others. The last government had a flirtation with that sector and gave some support to it and then withdrew that support. That work has started, and I think more can happen to deliver more. And it's certainly, if you have communities with local community land trusts or local housing working parties, far better than allowing the NIMBYs to take over and to start driving the development process. And then also I would encourage him to look at discounted sale homes. Before I worked in the community land trusts, I was a sceptic, but I have to say I'm a convert to that being used as one of the additional mechanisms to deliver intermediate housing. And I believe that it would be a cost-effective way for Homes England to also engage with communities that want to deliver in perpetuity, which is clearly very, very important, in perpetuity homes for locals. And finally, I hope that the Minister will look, as well as regulating the private rented sector. Of course, we don't want Rackmans. We want to drive out bad practice from that sector, but also perhaps taking a cue from what's happening in the holiday letting sector. Why not reward good landlords if they're delivering security, affordable rents, high EPC, and all of those and decent home standards? If they're delivering all of that, surely there must be a way within the tax system to actually reward good landlords, as well as to, if you like, penalise and regulate the bad ones. So I would urge him finally to look at that. So I hope that the Minister will consider each of the points that I've made to him, and I'm grateful that I've been given the additional time to indeed elaborate on the important points made. And of course, the Minister has plenty of time to respond as well. I don't know whether others wish to make a contribution. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Jayne Kirkham.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you also for granting extra time to hear this debate, which is so important for Cornwall, and thank you very much to the Honourable Member opposite for calling this debate, which is incredibly important and gives us a chance to speak about Cornwall and the very particular issues that we have in Cornwall with housing. As the Honourable Member said, there are about 27,000 people in reality on the housing waiting list in Cornwall, and we have about 800 people in temporary and emergency accommodation. Many of them now are families with young children who are placed in caravan parks and holiday homes up to an hour and a half, 2 hours away from their support networks, their schools, their jobs and where they live. And this is really affecting community cohesion and upsetting families and causing real hardship. The council is struggling with the need. The cost is vast. They are providing bunk cabins in council car parks for people to live in as emergency and temporary accommodation, which is very, very difficult. And also so many people now in Cornwall are living in their vans because they simply have nowhere else to go. I'm finding that the families are moving into the emergency accommodation, and the single people that I was finding when I was first a councillor in Cornwall becoming homeless are now living in their cars. It's become really dire. And the businesses now are finding that key workers have nowhere to live. So we're having people coming down, be they working in the hospitality sector or agriculture, or even professionals like teachers and nurses and doctors, A head teacher in Cornwall struggled to find somewhere to live and actually had to give up her job and move away again. And there is now a movement called Homes for Cornwall, where a lot of the businesses in Cornwall are coming together and trying to find alternative solutions for dealing with the housing crisis in Cornwall, which has got so bad that they can't find staff. We do have, as the Honourable Member said, very low numbers of social housing in Cornwall, only 10,300 council homes. I want to move at this point to talk a bit about the Affordable Housing Programme grant that Cornwall had suspended by a previous Secretary of State, Michael Gove, because of poor performance of Cornwall Housing, the housing provider, arm's length company of the council. That performance has now improved, and that grant is desperately needed to go towards a new social housing scheme in Cornwall in Redruth. But it hasn't been returned. I was going to ask the Minister if he could look into that and to see whether other local authorities in this situation have been treated in the same way and lost their grant. And has that grant now moved to other registered providers within Cornwall, or has it left Cornwall completely? Is there any way we could get that back and backdated? The other issue, as the Honourable Member spoke about, is second homes and holiday lets, which have absolutely exploded in Cornwall, particularly since COVID. The private rented sector has been decimated and is virtually non-existent now. And we've struggled so much with Section 21 notices, which explains to a great extent why so many of our families are now in that emergency and temporary accommodation. I will give way.
I thank the Honourable Member for giving way, and I commend my honourable friend, the Member for St Ives, for securing this excellent debate. And it's great to welcome him back to his place. He brings a wealth of expertise in this area. And I'd also like to welcome the Minister to his place, and I hope that he understands some of the issues that have been raised already in this debate, given that he's a close neighbour of ours as well. I also welcome the cross-party cooperation that we're seeing from honourable members across this House, not so much from the Conservative benches, unfortunately, this evening. But Cornwall faces a real housing emergency, and it's so critical that we work together to fix it. As the honourable member, my honourable friend for St Ives, mentioned earlier, we must finally move away from building more and more executive housing, which has little to no infrastructure, and focus on local need.
Can I remind my honourable friend, interventions are short.
I'd just like to ask the honourable member if she agrees with me that the long-standing Liberal Democrat policy of introducing use classes for non-permanent occupancy is a good idea.
In Kirkham.
Thank you very much to the Honourable Member for that, and I will be moving on to some of the ways that we can deal with the issue of the proliferation of second homes and holiday lets and the upset of the balance very shortly. I also wanted to reinforce the point that the Honourable Member made about the tax loophole, I think 18 million now that is lost in council tax because so many houses have taken advantage of that loophole where they can claim business rates and the exemption, the zero-rated exemption, rather than pay council tax if they are let out for 10 weeks of the year. And as the Honourable Member said, so much money was lost during COVID in business grants. I think £170 million went in business grants to those properties that were registered as holiday lets. I wanted to mention, because he can't speak, the Honourable Member for Plymouth Devonport, who has worked hard with us in Cornwall about this issue of first homes rather than second homes, and has supported us, as I know the same issue applies up in Devon as well. We have spoken previously with the Minister about the potential of a toolkit of measures that could be used to deal with some of these issues of second homes and holiday lets. One of those is one that I know that our government wants to introduce and will be introducing, which is licensing of holiday lets, hopefully with fees and those safety checks on those holiday lets, which isn't done at the moment. So some properties aren't checked at all for fire safety or safety in any way, and that's a massive loophole that needs to be dealt with. The Honourable Member talked about planning requirements. A use class for holiday lets is something that the previous government, I think, had a review upon but didn't do very much about. So there is that possibility of looking at that particular measure, and that could be defaulted to second home owners having to apply for a change of use if they were to flip to provide their homes as holiday lets. The other one, of course.
Very grateful for further to the excellent point made by my elder friend for North Cornwall. Just on that point of the C5 category, the last government proposed and tinkered with and certainly announced and re-announced on many occasions the proposal to introduce the use class for holiday lets. But does she not agree with me that it'd be far better if it applied to all non-permanent occupancy, whether it be second homes or holiday lets? So otherwise there will continually be flipping from one to the other in order to avoid regulation.
Thank you to my honourable friend. I wanted to move on actually and talk particularly about the council tax as well, because strangely this was one of the few things that the entire council agreed upon, and we are a Conservative council at the moment in Cornwall, to double council tax on empty second homes. And in fact, we wrote to the Secretary of State at the time asking for if we could triple the council tax on second homes, as they do in Labour Wales. So that was a very unusual thing for them to do. And of course, as has been previously discussed, looking at closing that loophole so that owners of property cannot flip between business rates and council tax, and that would gain £18 million a year in council taxes. So I wanted to finish really by agreeing with the honourable member that we should be encouraging cooperative and community housing in Cornwall. It's very, very popular, and if it was supported more, there would be a great deal more of it. In fact, our Cabinet housing member in Cornwall has talked to that if every village built 10 homes, it would deal with the housing crisis completely. Discouraging hope value, particularly in certain parts of Cornwall, would certainly be very helpful, and forcing developers to deliver their affordables rather than rely on that viability defence. I know that's part of the government's plans, because so often developers get to a point and then say they can't afford to build the affordable houses that they promised. And the other point that is a real problem is the cost of building has shot up because the contractors in Cornwall have dropped in number and become a great deal more expensive.
I call the Minister, Matthew Pennycook.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I start by congratulating the member for St Ives on securing this important debate, and I commend him for the forceful but also thoughtful case he made on behalf of his constituents. He has, I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, considerable experience and expertise when it comes to housing policy and practice, and I listened with great interest to his views and to many of the proposals he made. Madam Deputy Speaker, could I also thank my honourable friend, the member for Truro and Falmouth, for her incisive contributions, and all those who have added to the debate this evening. There is clearly a fierce clarity of purpose on both sides of the House in respect of meeting housing need across the county, and I want to assure all honourable members present that this government is resolved to do what is necessary to ensure that can happen. It would also be remiss of me, Madam Deputy Speaker, if I didn't acknowledge my honourable friend, the member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport. He's not a Cornish MP, but his constituency, I know, suffers from many of the challenges that honourable members have touched upon this evening. Indeed, is impacted by those challenges coming from Cornwall, and he's been a champion over many years for bold action to tackle the housing crisis across the South West. Madam Deputy Speaker, as we've heard, the housing crisis in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly is acute. Eye-watering house price to earnings ratios that are putting home ownership out of the reach of most local people, an overheated and shrinking private rented sector that is placing severe strain on local economies as well as families and communities, and steadily growing social housing waiting lists. While recognising that they are not the sole cause of these pressures, none of them can be properly understood without accounting for the sharp increase in the numbers of second homes and short-term lets in the county over recent years, an issue to which I will return in due course. In the time I have available to me, and it's more time than I expected when I drafted this speech. I wanted to provide the honourable gentleman and other honourable members representing Cornish seats with an overview of the government's thinking in this area and a sense of how we intend to address the challenges around housing availability in the county, with the caveat that there is a limit to the detail I can provide at this point in time, given that we are a new government still considering the best options to achieve our aims. Madam Deputy Speaker, the causes of England's housing crisis are multiple, but among the most important is our singular failure as a nation to build enough homes of all tenures. That is why this government is determined to do what is necessary to get the country building again, including by ensuring we put in place a planning system geared towards meeting housing need in full. When it comes to our proposed reforms to the National Planning Policy Framework, I acknowledge the honourable gentleman's concerns about the introduction of mandatory housing targets, and I appreciate that he made a nuanced argument, but I'm afraid I'm unconvinced by them. The fact that the distribution of homes in his constituency is creating significant challenges for the communities he represents is not, in my view, an argument against ensuring that sufficiently ambitious targets are in place to boost housing supply. I will in a sec, I'll just finish this point. Rather, it, in my view, is an argument for making sure that individual local planning authorities have the full set of tools they need to manage those distributional challenges alongside planning locally for development in line with their targets in a way that meets local need.
Will the Minister, thank you, give consideration to a hypothesis I believe alluded to earlier by the Right Honourable Member for St Ives, namely that building the wrong kind of housing in Cornwall can in fact beget demand for the kind of housing that we have so struggled to build, namely truly affordable and social homes?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that point. I acknowledge the pressures, I acknowledge the challenges, and I think what we need to do is give local authorities the tools they need to shape, not only through their local plans, the type of development that comes forward, but to get a grip in particular on excessive concentrations of second homes and short-term lets, and that is the government's intention. But on the MPPF and housing targets specifically, it's the government's considered view that we need to act to increase supply in all parts of the country and to take steps, as I said, to ensure that the housing market is responding to the needs of communities. These are complementary, not conflicting policy intentions. More than happy to give way.
The Minister for giving way. And as I said, I entirely endorse the sentiment behind what the Minister is trying to do. It's just that the practicalities are that there are enormous opportunities for those unscrupulous developers to use the NPPF as a Trojan horse in order to crowbar very significant lottery wins on land. If you can convert an agricultural acre into an open market acre of development land, you don't need to work for a living. You just need to keep shoving in planning applications and make a lot of money. And so having some intermediate measure by which you can deliver affordable homes on that land is surely the way forward.
Well, and I've touched on rural exception sites and the land market in particular, if you'll allow me, in my speech. But I would come back to the point that I think none of that negates the need for ambitious housing targets to underpin via consents and oversupplying consents to ensure that we're building the right number of homes we need. But I take his point, I'll address it directly in short order, starting with land values. Because I know he raised a specific concern, and he's raised it not only in this place but in other forums, about our proposed changes to national planning policy, potentially placing, as I understand it, upward pressure on land values and thereby frustrating the government's objectives. Now, we appreciate fully the risk, which is why we are committed to further strengthening the system of developer contributions and to reform of compulsory purchase compensation rules. Indeed, just today, I brought into force regulations that allow action to be taken in respect of HoC value where it is required in the public interest, but we will go further in the forthcoming planning and infrastructure bill. With regard to rural exception sites, which he also touched upon, the government very much recognises that people living in rural areas often face challenges in finding adequate affordable housing, and ensuring there is robust support for the necessary housing in rural areas is essential in our view to supporting the broader sustainability of rural communities. The National Planning Policy Framework is already clear that planning policies and decisions should support opportunities to bring forward small sites for affordable housing in rural areas. These rural exception sites should help meet the housing needs of rural communities, enabling local people or those with family or employment connection to live locally and help sustain a thriving place. However, I do want to go further to support rural affordable housing. And as part of the consultation on proposed reforms to the NPPF that was launched on the 30th of July, we are actively seeking views on what measures we should consider to better support and increase affordable housing development within rural areas. And I'd very much welcome the Honourable Gentleman's engagement on that point. And I will specifically take away the point he made about cross-subsidy and give that further consideration. Turning to the unique situation on the Isles of Scilly, which I very much recognise, in particular the challenges with regard to the viability of construction on the Isles. My officials are working closely alongside Homes England to support the Council to achieve its housing ambitions, and it's important that this close collaboration continues. I also note the wider challenges on the Isles and how housing challenges interact with other pressures faced by residents. In recognition of this, my officials are looking to convene a working group with other government departments to highlight the plurality of issues and to ensure that the government can best support island residents. With regard to community-led housing, which he touched upon, and I appreciate the members' interest both in the community-led housing sector, including the role of community land trusts and his experience professionally in this area. I recognise the role that community ownership of land and affordable homes can play in delivering the government's agenda, although I hope you will recognise that the support we're able to offer must be considered in the round alongside the full range of departmental programmes. But again, the government has set out changes to how we plan for the homes we need as part of that NPPF consultation, and that included, I'll just finish this point and I will give way, that included proposals designed to strengthen support for community-led housing.
Thank you, and thank you to the Minister for giving way and to the member for St Ives and the Isles of Scilly for securing this important debate. In the constituency I represent, beautiful South East Cornwall, local residents are being priced out and we don't have the homes that we need. Earlier this summer, an elderly couple from Tor Point in my constituency were forced to live apart for more than 4 months, both in their 90s, after an accident at their own home left one in the hospital and a lack of suitable housing allowed them not to live together. Does he agree with me that we need action on second homes so local people, such as this couple from Tor Point, can benefit from more of the housing being built?
I thank my honourable friend for that point, and she preempts me because I'm just about to turn to second homes and short-term lets, but I very much take her point. I'm sorry to hear about the situation that her constituents from Tor Point, I think she said, find themselves in. And the government do recognise this is an area where more needs to be done. So with regard to the prevalence of second homes and short-term lets, both in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency and the county more widely, it is beyond doubt that this has constrained the availability of homes for local residents to buy and to rent, and also that it is having a detrimental impact on local services in many areas. Now, a balance obviously needs to be struck between the benefits that second homes and short-term lets can and do have for local economies and their impact on local people. But the experience of many coastal, rural and indeed urban communities grappling with excessive concentrations of such properties. And when I was the opposition lead on housing planning, I spoke to many colleagues in the last Parliament facing these pressures in an acute form in their constituencies. But those experiences and the feedback we are getting from coastal, rural and some urban communities makes clear that we've not yet got that balance right. More than happy to give way.
Thank you for giving way. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So, I thank my honourable friend for raising these difficult issues around housing and second homes in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, and we have very parallel issues in the constituency I represent, which is South Devon, so just a little bit further up the coast. It's very apt that we're having this discussion today after the presentation of the Devon Housing Commission's report at lunchtime, which highlighted many of these issues and just how difficult the situation is in Devon as in Cornwall. I'd just like to raise the issue again of second homes, which are literally hollowing out communities in my constituency. And as the member for Truro and Falmouth said, I've had a head teacher, the local hospital...
Minister.
I thank the honourable lady and appreciate she was cut off As Madam Deputy Speaker and indeed Mr Speaker and the other deputies remind us, interventions do have to be short, but we can pick up the conversation outside the chamber, I'm sure. But I do recognise the unique challenges that in particular, as I say, excessive concentrations of second homes and short-term lets are having on communities. Now, the Honourable Gentleman touched on in his remarks that the previous government did introduce a limited number of measures in response to concerns expressed in the previous Parliament. In opposition, I welcomed these while making clear that they did not go far enough, and that remains my firm view. As such, while we will progress with measures such as the introduction of a registration scheme for short-term lets in England and the abolishment of the furnished holiday let tax regime, we are also considering what additional powers we might give local authorities to enable them to better respond to the pressures they are facing, and I will update the House as soon as I am in a position to do so. In conclusion, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Honourable Member for St Ives once again for giving the House an opportunity to consider these important matters, and I very much look forward to engaging closely with him and all other Cornish members so that together we can ensure first homes for all local people in Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The ayes have it. Order, order.